Okay, so I guess we will begin again, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Rachel Blau-Duplessis, a scholar and critic and poet of great stature, whom I'm sure requires no introduction of her own, and Rachel will introduce Nicole Brossard.
Quand je relisais les textes de Nicole Brossard, je me suis rendu compte encore une fois de la prodigalité de son œuvre et la force de son projet. C'est un projet de pensée féministe et de résistance à la culture dominante. Mes remarques commencent en français pour souligner, même célébrer, le fait, non sans ses propres défis, de construire une culture bilingue ou bien de lutter pour une telle culture. Dans cette lutte à la fois difficile et nécessaire, Nicole Brossard jouait un rôle important avec ses poèmes, ses romans expérimentaux, ses essais et sa création des journaux, qui tous contribuent à la pensée de notre époque. I'm honored to introduce Nicole Brossard here at Kelly Writers House in a conference itself important and indicative of collective interests and of collective differences between key writers of Canada and its neighbor to the south. Nicole Brossard has written quite a number of books, more than 30, poems, floating evocative works, poised between abstract and concrete in a particular liminal space, and deturned or torqued novels. She is considered avant-garde, that is, both innovative and transgressive, but particularly meaningfully so by the intermingling of her aesthetic concerns with structure and form and her political meanings about situations, characters, and actions. Sections from Brossard's work introduced by Jennifer Moxley have just appeared from the University of California Press and are probably out there. Okay, are out there. I didn't have a chance to check. Brossard is known as someone who has investigated culture through the pressure she has put via feminist and lesbian thinking onto hegemonic assumptions. In her life, starting in the mid-60s and into the feminist and lesbian revolutions of the 70s, and in her work, she has spoken for a transformed generation of women whose energy, cultural fervor, sexual pulsion, and intellectual transformations have had a gigantic cultural impact. Nicole Brossard is a writer who has ruptured the book in at least two ways of great interest and pertinence to me. The first is the complicated mise en abîme that she creates in her novels and her hybrid genre works. She has books within books, books that are mirroring books, new title pages of translated works that translate the books we just read, case histories and variations, all breaking in to the one solid iconic object, dare I call it phallocentric, breaking this into fractals and folds. Second, she has made an écriture au féminin her goal, her poetics, and her commitment. This exploration of feminine writing without the E, or writing in the anti-patriarchal zone, occurs precisely to dismantle hegemonic assumptions about gender and sexuality at the level of language and structure, not only at the level of content or findings. Her experiments in and with this goal in poetics and epistemology have been of the highest importance. I'm honored to have the opportunity to present Nicole Brossard.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for the introduction. Thank you so much, Charles and Sarah, for organizing this event. I was asking Charles, when was it? He said in 1985, when there was a great meeting of Canadian poets and American poets, which was very important. And I see Robert Pellman, he was also there at that moment. In French, we have an expression which says, ne perds pas le nord, which is do not lose north, of course, do not become crazy something like that. I thought I would lose a little bit the north and I wrote a little text called North of Invention. But I will not only talk about north for sure. North is a direction, but when we say north of invention, we either can think of future, geography, water, war, and politics, or insist on a magnetism toward silence, ultimate limit, the top frightening beauty of the planet, the dark, the light, and enjoy the idea of scary limit, scary borders. Yes, dwarf, shrubs, herbs, lichens, mosses, Arctic poppy, sedges, or Acorus calamus, named Sweet Flag by Henry David Thoreau. Reed, in French, a reed is a roseau. And if it becomes a roseau pensant, then it becomes a man, because we automatically think of the famous sentence by Blaise Pascal, l'homme est un roseau pensant. What about calamus? It also means pen, plume. Indeed, Walt Whitman added a section called the Calamus Poems to the third edition of Leaves of Grass in 1860. And the calamus has long been a symbol of love, lust, and affection. Should I now talk about the non-vascular plant and mention that a number of non-vascular plants possess tissues specialized for internal transport of water? Whoops! Here comes the wolverines, hermines, walrus, passing by as animals or as words. And then, oh baby, oil, gas, fresh water, 100 pages of fresh water to resist the grisly claw print logo of black water. Mais qu'est-ce que tu dis? Eau Noire is a fragrance by Christian Dior. A river in Belgium, a torrent in France, a violent stream, a déluge, un fleuve, quoi. Blast of blasphemies, God is an oil man, a guns lover, blow, 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 windy wind of wandering, blow that brain with God in it, blow the whole masterpiece of fright, that mixed drink of life, and that in your brain, blow, blow, windy wind of wandering, so we can enjoy amorously the aurora borealis and the constellations. Bon. It's hard to speak about poetry in English at a moment in my life where I need precision, concentration, and honestly, a great deal of positive sparkles about anything that used to be in the foreground of our human nature and the plus value we gave to it under the name of humanity and for sure of poetry. I guess the best way to talk about poetry is to focus on its constant renewal, need to incorporate reality in such a way that it opens in us a fault, une faille, I don't know the right word in English, which is not just a sensation, just an emotion, just a fascinating performance, but a breakthrough in our system of understanding and of coping with reality. Third note. Poetry remains poetry, which is to say, an effect of language which surprises, moves, and thwarts certitudes. Poetry puts us in a second state of mind, of desire, of presence, and of memory. I suppose that, of course, hunger, lack of sleep, sleep itself, music, dance, and of course, drugs do the same, with that difference that everything happens with words, only words, and their power to enchant, to discuss, to thrill. Each time we surprise in the mirror of language an unfamiliar and unusual glimmer of meaning, the poem starts figuring out something to compensate. We live out of that compensation, that renewal of compensation. And I guess I'm going to read now a little bit. C'est formidable. Merci. Water, water. Thank you for those pages. Thank you. I'm going to read a few passages on, well, years of writings, I suppose. Whatever the sadness, the melancholy, the anger we carry around with us might be, I doubt that it is possible to write poetry without an acquiescence to life, without enthusiasm, without zeal. These are needed to rip us out of reality and, paradoxically, to give us the intuitive comprehension required to understand the enigmas that comprise its complexity. The poem is always an event of fervor that oscillates between the pleasure of words and a powerful and renewed intuition of life. Much as I like to change identity and cultivate strangeness in my novels, I am in poetry, as much as I can be, faithful to myself in thought, in desire, and in imagination. For me, poetry is a consent to life which nourishes, modulates, and renews my relation to reality. Language always incites me to take action, depending upon the energy, the emotions, the sensation, it transforms itself, thought, vigilant, or ludic. Over the long term, it has been these variations that brought life to the tones and traits of my poetry. A bit as the features of the same face can vary depending upon the lighting and the feeling. Of course, existence alters the state's attitude toward writing, for example. At particular moment, it reinforces or produces changes in the uniqueness of a writing style. For example, Amante is a collection written in a state of limerence and love, just as La Viva affirms the first moments of my interest in translation, not only as a game of possible variations at the heart of meaning and value, but also as a subterranean current of strangeness when confronted with the elusive. Fictive translation is, as metaphor, a ludic practice, a generator of shifts in sense, a suite logique for the questions raised by the duo reality fiction as it has been revisioned and corrected by feminist consciousness. The two recent anthologies of my poetry witness of how I have traversed personal and collective space. This is usually what's interesting in an anthology. It allows me to take an overview of what I am calling, in contrast with biography, my biosemiology, as well as what makes up the nodes of fervor in a life of writing. Extravagance, rationality, unruliness, and love of exploration that make me who I am, in a certain way, have nourished and orchestrated the landscape of questions and upheavals which it seemed necessary to me to share in language and its poetic power. It is in this sense that whatever might be writers' manner of being, the main thing is to seize the ways in which their personal syntax and grammar generate vibration, reflection, destabilization, and dreams. It has been said since time immemorial that poetry is outside all finality, and that is what ensures its freedom of movement. This is true. At least it is good to think so. But I am unable to erase the idea of a seismography providing evidence for the unique energy that carves markers of meaning and hope in language. In my case, these markers will have been the body, the city, feminist consciousness, lesbian utopia and desire, my fascination with the act of writing, which goes on and goes on, language, translation, virtuality of linguistic expression, art and journeys, and all the new questions that have surged forth out of the new civilization we are entering, and which is affecting almost of all our certitudes. Certainly between the years 1966 and 74, my poetry is intermingled with the idea of text, its neutralité, dreamt as scientific and exploratory. Traces of this can be seen in l'écho Beaujeu, Suite Logique, Le Centre Blanc, Mécanique Jongleuse, and Masculin Grammatical. Indeed, even in the marginal way. An interesting phenomenon. These neutralized texts were not somehow as cold as they meant to be, but they appeared to be a philosophical, erotic, and sensual counter-melody. At least I hope it was the case. There is in my practice of the text an immense desire to understand, to thwart, and to transgress the organization of meaning. I also see in it an intention to give oneself pleasure through an extravagant use of words. Later, the idea of text found its form through encountering prose ideas. I am thinking here of La Mer, La Partie pour le Tout, certain poems in Lovers, as well as the collection Langues Obscures, which had not been translated until very recently. Some poems of it have been translated by Jennifer Moxley, and I will read some of them tomorrow night. As far as poetic prose is concerned, I believe it would be an interesting project to take a close look at the moment when poetic prose and prose poetry insinuate themselves into the aura of the poem, prove themselves necessary to the writing of the poem. The French poet René Daumal said, "Prose speaks about something. Poetry does something through words." Why this sudden need to speak about something, to normalize expression, the sentence, at the very least to give the impression of respecting syntactic convention? And at what moment must one cease to say poem in order to introduce the concept of prose poem or poetic prose? In 1934, Boris Pasternak was saying, "Poetry is prose, prose in action and not in narrative. Poetry is the language organic fact, which is to say, the living consequences." For my part, I have always associated prose with daily life, with that which is, in the final analysis, our obligatory connection to the real. Maybe that's the obligatory connection also to the citizen of this morning. Similarly, I have never ceased affirming that novelistic prose worked for me in negotiating with the real. In fact, I have often, through that prose so frequent in the poems in the feminine during the years 1975 to 1985 serve real life, concealed a need for life stories in the midst of upheavals that were working to disfigure linguistic norms. This is the major disobedience which is in the poem. And then to reconfigure meaning. This phenomenon of disfiguration is unique to the poem. Thus, we can say that the prose poem served as un garde-fou, mad guard, but that would not be the right translation, un garde-fou, protecting against a departure from the norm seen as too dangerous. In the same way, the prose poem could also be said to have allowed the feminine subject to infiltrate with a single stroke both poem and text, one and the other offering intimate and public zones, tracks of silence and participation in the human parade. I also find this phenomenon of disfiguration and reconfiguration today in young poets at a moment in history when the real, the fictional, and the virtual are tied for the first place as they are working to feed sense and nonsense simultaneously. It is a phenomenon we have gradually learned to use for ourselves in untangling the impossible concatenation of images and values that characterize the political and the ethical in today's essentially market-based society. At the time of the collection installation, it seemed to me that I was entering a new space of presence and of questioning. I believe that the turpid disquiet which accompanies the different words installations anticipates the questions about civilizations which would appear in my prose and poetry text starting in 1995 with Baroque d'Aube, then Musée de l'Os et de l'Eau, yesterday, Cahiers de Roses, notebooks of roses and civilization, and just recently after the words. In effect, from 1995 on, that is 5 years before changing centuries and millennium, at that moment when the big axes of globalization and the new technologies were setting themselves up and their effect beginning to make themselves felt on the cataloged and traditional dualities of humanism, such as true and false, good and evil, as well as the obvious constraint of space and time, on reproduction, origin, aging, our relation with nature, new propositions were starting to surge forth into the ethical space which had previously been circumscribed by the old and valid philosophical questions raised by the West. Words such as species, gene, humanity, century, and civilization arrived and chased away the vocabulary of utopia and desire without, for all that, erasing the words future and beauty, which for all time have spoken to us through the great symbols of night, light, the sea and the wind, the sun and the rain, the nape of the neck, the eye, mouth, blue, red and pink, black and white. All this time I am there, vigilant, attentive to bringing words together like time, bones, art and beauty, to trying to understand where our happiness lies, where tears and metaphors form concerning the intelligence of our species, as well as the pitiless violence of the merchant and archaic figures of this same species. But there is language, its incommensurable virtuality, which creates in large part the pleasure of word and of life. On the Indosyllabic of word, which is the title of one of my books, another journey of ardor can be foreseen in the midst of the melancholic and desiring beings that we are in the midst of dangerous cities and of the too hot planet and of the fascinating cosmos. Yes, I will be speaking for a long time yet of physically possessing poetry in the mobility of light. I will stop here. There are other things that, of course, we can talk about, how the invisible part of our life is working in our writing. But certainly one trio which has appeared, I don't know if it is the same in your writing, but before there was reality and there was fiction. But I think that now there is a trio, reality, fiction, and the virtual. And that trio, I guess, is what probably the new generation are working with. I am also fascinated by it, and I want to work with also that notion of virtuality, which in a way makes our way of thinking fluid and flexible. And that is why when we talk about politics, it gets more complicated. And in a way, I think citizens have been trying to figure out what's happening to them since the last 15 years, what has been happening to them since the last 15 years. And it's very difficult because I think we live in a moment when we look at the glass and it is, we can really say and be true by saying it's half empty and it's half full. And that is why very often the population are divided, 48, 42, 49, 51. This is also maybe a reason why the population are divided in the way they vote, for example, and things like that. Anyway, I'm just mentioning that because these are part of the question that I live with every day. And of course, I could just relax and take care of my own life, but those questions are part of me now. They are in my cells. They've been introduced in my molecule. Well, yes, because we cannot even rely on seasons. We cannot rely on anything except a few certitudes which are left to us, and where we say, no, that's enough. I'm not changing my mind about that. That's enough. But we are left finally with very few certitudes. Beg your pardon?
Do any come to mind right now?
Few certitude? Well, simply on our humanity. For example, I think what we've been calling our humanity was a tremendous way of being melancholic about something. The day we are left with no melancholy, no conquest of our origin, or no questions about our origins, Papa and Mom, and no question about death as a finishing term, but simply if that becomes a sickness, maladie, then it change its we have to change our mentality around it, and so on. And maybe that does not make necessary sense right now, but I think it definitely, we've been working with notions of melancholy, with notions of origin. Everyone wants to know about their origin, whether their parents, but their culture and so on. And it's the same, we know for sure that we will all die. And the day we start changing the paradigm or fantasize differently about that, already we are giving ourselves another space to fantasize or not to fantasize, just to be very docile. And so these are the questions that are there. Mm-hmm.
I was asked to think of a question as part of my task. And here's a question that comes in part out of the question I was going to ask, which was more about the past, to fill in the gap for people who didn't know about écriture au féminin, what that entailed. But then the tenor of your remarks, as they've come to us, the emphasis is not as fixedly on gender and sexuality as it was, which seems to be very interesting. And I would like you to sort of bridge the gap for us between those concerns that were so important to all of us at the moment of let's say, the 70s to the 80s, and the concerns that you now feel, which I do myself think of as being a kind of bridge, but I'm curious how you would formulate it.
Yes, well, that's a very important question. The bridge is still there. My anger is still there. I have more information, terrible information on how women are being treated, what we were saying in 1980 or something like that. And we fought a lot to think about those things we would be saying. It seems it still remains, reality is still the same for 90% of the women of this humanity. We are very lucky. We are a small percentage where we can talk and exercer sa liberté and so on. But my anger is the same. My information is more complete. My actions are there. But I cannot, I have to keep moving. And the thing is that, for example, which was two sentences which were very important for women. Nous aurons les enfants que nous voudrons. We'll have children that we desire, saying yes. But today, that notion of having a child, I mean, when a grandmother can give birth to her daughter's children, the old notion of the origin of giving birth and so on has changed completely. Of course, family is reshaping itself and so on, but when you think of notion like that, the notion of family or giving birth, being at the origin of, and so on. And the same sentence for la vie privée est politique. Private life is political. But private life, the personal is the political, but the personal is all over TV, all over the place. And people are being paid to say that they were raped, that they were victim of incest or of violence, and so on. So you understand, two key expressions have been totally changed and reinterpreted by exactly the change of technologies, also infiltrating the daily life, the daily gesture, the daily, yes. And so, in other words, we know what to do, we know how we should behave in action and in the real life, but when you're in writing, you keep going thinking. What you know is a slogan to you, unless you decide there's a visual artist writing slogans and form, but unless you decide to write slogans, it will not be writing, because writing is that kind of freedom which can be scary, which can be beautiful, which is essential for sure, but you cannot repeat when you are in writing. I don't want to repeat. I have always said that I am an explorer. I'm not a witness. I'm an explorer in my language, and therefore, I write, I would say, probably I keep moving throughout questions in my writing. And this morning, when Lisa was talking about poetry also in relation with the citizen, very often I have said that as a feminist, when I was not finding, it was hard to find the answer, either as a feminist or as a lesbian and so on, it was always the poet who would find a kind of answer, who would mix the anger, the utopia, and the combat all together. It was the poet, I guess, because it was the sentence. It was the sentence, and what the sentence would déclencher, would unleash, exactly. Because, I'm sorry, that sentence really needs to unleash something.
Oh, did you? Nicole, this is something I've been wondering about quite a bit in terms of what you're saying, that the whole idea of humanity is now shifting somewhat. Hasn't that always been, and I'm putting it this tentatively, if I just take, say, 3 examples. Take the example of, say, the African slave trade that went on for 500 years while people were extolling the rights of man, for instance. Or take the Jewish Holocaust that happened while Germans saw themselves as whatever, or the genocide of First Nations peoples. So what I'm wondering is it that the technology now brings it home to us in a way that people could live without knowing about these things, or maybe even while knowing about it, somehow were able to, contain it? I just wondered if you had any, because I'm just wondering whether this is entirely new to us as humankind.
Well, what is entirely new is the fact that we can manipulate our gene for the first time. And therefore, there is no, pas de champ for comparison. It's the first time that human beings are able to manipulate their genes. That's one thing. On the other hand, the violence and the madness and the greediness is still there, and it will get worse. It will get worse, actually. We've seen it since the last 15 years. The greediness and the violence, and it will be like that. Because, but at the same time, there is that other world. I remember when I was watching science fiction films, I could never understand why there were people crawling in the street, full of hunger and so on, and on the other hand, why there were sophisticated people in laboratories. But this is where we're getting at right now. You have a sophistication, and on the other hand, you have people who have reculé, stepped back, since the word democracy succeeded for a while to make an important change. Now, that word, for example, someone was talking about freedom this morning, but the word democracy is also on the verge of going away. Absolutely. I guess, yeah. And so I don't know if I answer your question, but definitely we still need a memory and history. But at the same time, we know that whether we want it or not, we will be conditioned in such a way that, well, we already live in the present time. On enjambe, how do you say that? Enjamber du présent. You know, instead of having the 3 dimensions of past, present, and future, we keep walking over the present time. So we memorize nothing. And we have sensations, but less and less we have emotions, because emotions, they take time. They have to be constructed in our mind through a narrative. They take time. Sensation, we get them, and we forget them, and the next day we get another one, or we repeat if it was pleasant or not. This does something also to everyone. So there's 2 kind of people, actually, those working in 3 dimensions with the memory, the present and the future, and another kind to which mostly we belong, which lives in the present time with those little machine, iPod and so on, which makes us qui font qu'on se comporte différemment. See, yes, that we behave differently when you have what seems lover at the lunch, and they keep watching their telephone instead of, se regarder dans les yeux. We've changed. Something has changed. Yes. I'm sorry.
Est-ce que c'est possible que vous pourriez lire un petit peu de Fences and Breathing peut-être 5 minutes. Nous sommes très intéressés de votre poésie. Is it possible for you to read a little bit of your poetry for the next few minutes? It would be great if we could hear some more poetry. Maybe?
Well, this is prose.
Yes. Okay. Un prose poème, no?
I don't know. I will answer another question, and maybe I could. I don't know what is. Yes. Oui.
Oh, you want to ask? Okay. Well, I don't want to preempt the reading. I want love to hear the reading too, but I just wanted to kind of turn the conversation, in a sense, back to a dynamic that, in this context here at Cali Writers House, I think would be worth pondering. You're a writer. You're one of the few writers who, in a sense, like Aaron Moret, who kind of live in the world of, as a writer, you live in this world of translation. I mean, I've always only known you through translation, and it's an amazing thing, at least for us in Canada, how we've come to know Nicole's writing over many, many years, and through translation. And this comes down to, very specific things on using language and that. So you've been in a sense, at the mercy of your translators. At the same time, I want to applaud where you've come to today to be able to speak so eloquently in English about what it is you do and what it is you feel about writing. Could you comment a little bit on how you feel about having, in a sense, you're living in both spaces, but you live in this world of translation as a writer, when I'm curious about that, because I don't.
Yes, and I have to say that I am very lucky to have had the translators that I have had, which is so vital because it makes you exist in another language, in another culture. I wish I could do that also with Spanish or other languages. This has been very important, and I think it imprinted on me in different ways, but certainly also in the way I write my novels. For example, in the Fences of in Breathing, it is the narrator is writing a novel which is not in her mother tongue, like many writers do, of course. But for that notion, as I said in what I was reading about strangeness, I'm a stranger. I know who I am, and on the other hand, I like to be a stranger of myself, and probably this is to be related to the fact that very early on I was translated into English, and also, and this I've said also publicly, that the English community of writers, whether in Canada or in the United States, has been very important in my life, as much important in my life as the French community in Quebec. And I'm learning a lot coming here today and tomorrow. I keep learning, and I learn about poetry, but I learn also about one word which we don't use very much in Quebec, which is the word community. I learn a lot about that force, that great force, I would say. And yes, and maybe also this is when I said at the beginning that I'm going to speak English, but finally, for what I might have to say today, maybe it would have to be written in French, because I'm trying to figure out and understanding things. And that, I guess, I would have to figure it out in French, even though when talking about it in English, but it's not really by talking about it, it's by writing about it. Because when you write, for example, the first text I read, North of Invention, it just came to me. I was making some research, and that information was coming, this little fleet. But, so many information that it constitutes a reality. But this is because I was writing, and it's the same in French. Even if I'm writing an essay, the essay will move it only because the words will be moving and removing and moving all the time. So yes, I was. It's very privileged to exist, so that people can read you in another language, can hear you also in another language. And it's once you know a little bit the language, you open the door to a culture, and then behind that culture, you learn so many things as well. Yes. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Nicole, I was really struck with the way that you talked about the seismographic markers in your work, and I wasn't sure if you were talking specifically about the 74 to 85 period, but one of those markers that you pointed to was the city. So I just wonder if I could ask you to expand on that a little bit, because that's also a period of time where cities are undergoing a dramatic change from a lot of the same processes that you're pointing out are changing our daily life at this moment. So that's the general question. The slightly more specific question is this: if I could ask that about the book that was translated in English as The Book, how the city functions in that work, which for me was a dynamically influential book.
Yes. Well, I have to say that in Quebec in 1965, in the early 60s, the city was, well, there was one city. It was Montreal. And Montreal was not the French city. It was an English city at that time. Most of the Québécois were working people. They were staying in Saint-Henri, in a small area of the city. And everything was written in English. So it was a foreign city. And a lot of the poets were coming from outside of Montreal. And so the city was never mentioned. There was no culture of the city. And at the same time, the city was a sin, because if you, a young woman, especially a young woman, of course, was going to the city, of course, she would become a prostitute, the parents would think, and so on. So it really was a terrible place. You would get killed, you would get raped, and so on, which might have been true, but the city was fantasized as a sin or something like that. And I think my generation, which was in fact the first generation to live in the city, to enjoy the anonymity of the city, to the cinema, the life, the terrace, the drinks, the life in the city, the conversation also, because when you say city, you mean how people are exchanging values, resisting values, and so on. And so it became important. So there was that first book you mentioned, which is also very close to the politic life of that time. And then there will be also Sold Out, which is also about Montreal, but a Montreal, let's say, of the 40th, which was the Montreal of my parents more. But I would do the research and talk about that Montreal. And then there was French Kiss, which is also the Montreal, the crossed by through the street Sherbrooke, which is the longest street, and which also the French Kiss happens at the rupture of the French and English au coin de Saint Laurent, and so this is the city has always been a place where you discover people, where you exchange with people, where you fight with people, but where culture will intermix and so on. And it's still there. The last book of poetry I published, which was published in France, is called Lointaine, which is far away, but in the French, in the feminine form, and it is about different cities, but not necessarily recognizable as Montreal or Paris or Calgary or whatever. Regina is mentioned in that city, in that book. It's very, but it's mostly it's what's happening in the city somehow. The energy, the shocks, the collision, the whatever, the culture, the religion, and so on, what it does. So the city is still, yes, important, yeah.
Just one quick thought from what you just said about the gender of nouns in French, how clearly that's a crucial tool that you use in writing. What's your sense of it over here in English without gender? I mean, how in a way to have? I mean, I know there's gender in the English-speaking world, but in the language, where you can't just change the, you can't just say, this is you can't just add an E or not add an E, etc. Any just thoughts about either the, impoverishment or the, weird stoicism that creates?
Well, I know it's not an impoverishment because I know you poets do many things with it, and so renew it. But it's for sure that even it's in French, c'est terrible because it makes women invisible because the masculine takes over the feminine any time. So if there are 300 women and one man, if you put an adjective, you will never see the 300 women. You will only see the masculine form. So it makes women invisible, and this for sure has and had consequences in the imaginaire and so on. Toward English, it's different. I don't write enough in English to see what I'm lacking. In the real life, it's a chairperson, so you meet a lot of person. And depending, on whom you want to meet. But it's, yes. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but oui, c'est ça. Voilà, donc. Can you read something for us? I will try to read something. Okay. C'est en anglais, et the translation is by Suzanne de Lotbinière Harwood. And I'll read two little passages. I often tell myself I've understood it all. Not at all, but what is it? I've understood so well, I can pretend so well that it's necessary to understand everything. I don't exist for nothing. My sketchbook is proof of this, and I never cry, except evenings when I absolutely have to sleep in a park so I don't disturb anyone, and because it helps me concentrate on the laughter bursting from all over town. Women laugh in such ways that we can't see the fancies in their breathing, and thus I can often touch their fur before going to sleep. This morning when I woke up, I was myself again. I don't understand why I am myself without warning, as though since I have been sleeping at the chateau, living in the foreign language, has crushed my identity. This morning, when I got up this morning, I truly felt I had reintegrated my movement, my breathing, my worries. Authentic and ancient autumn is coming. That's how it is. Coming for sure. I'm going to be cold and mixed up my characters between the lines, the number of sketches, the naughty pleasures, fear, and the people I often call us. I will have to learn to remain in suspense over my sketches, to shut my eyes before diving into the blackness. When black occurs, great big markers of night among the planets, I can plainly see that night constantly changes the shade of its jet black, and that this is conducive to fear and to the swirling around the words in my mouth when someone talks to me with sincerity in the first person. I have trouble breathing, as if there were a fine dust of silence and cosmos pouring into me, a cannibal force capable of swallowing my own dreams. Stay alive, says the voice, also applies to all girls. Whoever you are, stay alive because of the smooth wind through the roses and through your raptures. Stay alive. Show yourself with your syllables and your images. Don't be afraid to touch your melancholy. Stay alive despite the flies and the burns, the little decorations, everyone's closed armoire. Stay alive, arms open like pages of the dictionary. Breathe high and loud between the signs, the mirrors, the little sketches. Don't forget your gris-gris and Latin grammaire. Stay alive despite your mother in her bathtub, terrorists and liars. Stay alive in the moon's axis and touch, go ahead, touch your mirrors in the right places before watching yourself leave. Stay alive like somebody who is not you.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.